My best is to say
It started. Yeah. Oh, it started. I think we can just check. It says it's you're on the live stream right now. I love that for you. Well, it says the mics are operating, right? If we end the stream, can we restart it? Just log on to the YouTube. Oh my god.
Oh, right. Yep. Okay.
Oh, I see. Yeah, it's too small. I don't like it too bright. I don't like to see it. Yeah, but I like to I always in our all right, welcome everybody. I think we're gonna get started. Come on over. This is like desert land of chairs. You can all like move in. Nobody bites. Okay, well whatever. There are chairs. So it's a very special night tonight because we are celebrating the launch of Joselyn Takacs, Pierce Oysters. Yay! I will read her bio and everything in 1 second, but before we go into the actual programming here, I'm Zibby, by the way. Should I say that? I'm Zibby Owens. Okay, whatever. We have Blue Plate Oysterette here, so I wanted Nick to say a few words about Blue Plate Oysterette. We're so excited to have you.
We're actually a double. We're also Divine Vintage.
And Divine Vintage.
Next block up, and that's what you're drinking this from. We thought we'd bring the oyster band down. We've had that for about 6 years now. We found that at Boston. Her name's Pearl, a little oyster truck. And we just take them all around the place, just doing chucking oysters, food from the restaurant, pretty much. We've also got Divine Vintage, which we've been open about 1.5 years now. We're the next block down next to Creation. So it's vintage clothing, jewelry, and about 250 different wines from all around the world. Not a lot of domestic. I want to show people wines from everywhere. So the one you're drinking now is from Spain. So it's a sparkling wine made the same way as champagne, and they call it cava in Spain. There's a little bit of Chardonnay in here, but it's mostly Spanish grapes. And it's made the same way as champagne, where the second fermentation is the bottle, so you get a bit more flavor to it. It's organic, it's biodynamic, so it works with all the lunar cycles. It's female made, and it's $20, which is pretty good. So this is a good party wine rather than having champagne. And yeah, female, but organic and vegan. Let's say vegan as well. And I think if you have a sparkling wines go so well with oysters. When you've got oysters, they're quite briny, they're quite sort of sea salty. And by having something that's citrusy, so we've got this acidity like a lemon, that really helps to sort of cleanse your mouth after you've had salty oysters. So the oysters we've got today are from New Zealand. They're called kaipara. And just coming into the winter down there, so the waters are cold, and you're getting prime winter oysters all summer long. So we've got these down at the restaurant. We've had them for about 7 years now. So every winter we switch to those. So I suggest trying some cava with the New Zealand oysters. Come and see us down at Divine. We just got a wine bar license approval last week.
Ooh.
So the glass, like cheese board, charcuterie, that sort of thing. So hopefully in sort of 4 to 6 weeks, we'll start construction next week. We can do wine bar designs, which will be fun. Yeah. So have a good night tonight. Enjoy the
Okay, some bio information. Joselyn. Okay, Joselyn Takacs holds a PhD. She's the author of Pierce Oysters, debut author. Joselyn holds a PhD in creative writing and literature from the University of Southern California and an MFA in fiction from Johns Hopkins University. Her fiction has appeared in Gulf Coast, Narrative, Tin House, Harvard Review, the Rumbus Diagram, Columbia Journal of Art and Literature, and elsewhere. She has published interviews and book reviews in the Los Angeles Review of Books and Entropy. Joselyn has taught writing at the University of Southern California and Johns Hopkins University. She lived in New Orleans at the time of the 2010 Deepwater Horizon spill, and in 2015 she received a grant to record the oral histories of Louisiana oyster farmers in the wake of the environmental disaster. She currently lives in Portland, Oregon, with her husband. That is Joselyn. And she will be joined by Amy Silverberg, who is a writer and comedian based here in Los Angeles. Her short stories have appeared in Best American Short Stories, the Paris Review, Granta, and elsewhere. Her debut novel, First Time, Long Time, is forthcoming. Oh, that's exciting. From, sorry, my daughter. From Grand Central Publishing in 2025. She also writes television, most recently The Movie Show on the Sci-Fi Channel. Amy's stand-up comedy has appeared on Comedy Central, Hulu, Amazon Prime, and NPR. In 2018, she was featured as a new face at the prestigious Just for Laughs Comedy Festival in Montreal, and she holds a PhD in creative writing and literature from USC, where she currently teaches. Amazing.
You never know where to look during the bio.
I know. If you like hearing me read people's bios, you'll love my podcast. Moms don't have time to read books. I read bios every time and then interview authors. So tune into that and you can hear my conversation with Joselyn. And now enjoy. Also, I should just say that I also have a publishing house called Zibby Books, and we published this book, which is our first real substantial literary fiction that we did with our whole team who still works there now, our executive editor Kathleen. And so this is a particularly meaningful publication for us. I remember so well trying to convince Joselyn to join us saying, we could do all these fun marketing things, like, let's have pop-up oyster restaurants. And she's like, what? And so I was like, we have to have a pop-up oyster restaurant. I told her we would. And so there it is. Mission accomplished. Enjoy.
I'm excited to be here with Joselyn. I also want to say that we got our PhDs together and we took fiction workshops together. And I remember reading early chapters of this novel and just looking over at Joselyn and thinking, oh, she's such a good writer. Soon I will see this in bookstores, and now I get to, so it's a thrill for me.
It wasn't soon. It was a
Well,
long time ago
okay.
that I was working on.
Time is flimsy. Can I ask you to read from the beginning?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Zibby, for having me. This is a dream come true, and this week has been a dream come true.
You want us to talk louder?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Okay. Thank you.
We turned the air off, so.
Jordan Pierce had left the boat's captain just as his father had arranged it, as if Al might step in from the heat and tell him where to go next. It was a good old oyster boat, built to purpose in 1972, a 65-foot shallow draft boat, a barge really, designed to cruise in 2.5 feet of water while ferrying 40 sacks of oysters on the broad face of its front deck. Jordan's grandfather built the boat with profits from the family's oyster reefs, inherited from his father, who established the first reef behind his fishing camp on Cheniere Caminada, a peninsular arm reaching into Caminada Bay. There, the oysters quickly grew fat and briny in the warm, brackish water so near the Gulf of Mexico. He leased this pot of water bottom from the state of Louisiana in 1919 and built up the reef with spent oyster shells, which he dropped the boatload year after year down to the mud. So began the Pierce Oyster Company. In 1975, the boat passed to Jordan's father as a wedding gift. At the time, it was called Fortuna, after a fortune. His father rechristened it May's Day in blue paint on the stern after Jordan's mother. Not that May would spend any time on it. For the next 4 decades, May's Day dredged the same reefs in the Barataria and Terrebonne parishes, and in those years, except for changing captains, fortunes, and too few coats of paint, the boat had hardly changed at all. On the wall opposite the galley kitchen were pictures Jordan's father had pinned up with thumbtacks. Redfish dangling on the line, Jordan and his brother Benny, young, each holding up a crab pot, and the old-timers, his grandfather, father, and uncle. Here they stood in a row, corralled, Jordan guessed, by his mother behind the camera, with their hands in their pockets, their caps casting shadows on their square faces. Even while they lived, even while still somewhat young, they had looked to Jordan like men out of photographs, like leftovers from some older way of the world now gone. The dashboard held old papers, maps, and curios bleached from sun. At one end was a hula girl swaying on her suction cup when the waves picked up. On the other end, a figurine of the Virgin Mary glued in place. A string of Mardi Gras beads hung around her ankles. In the cabinet below the dash was a framed and jaundiced time span out of nature, and you find it's tied to everything in the universe. I'll stop there.
I love that line, you pluck one thing out of nature and you find it's tied to everything. I just want to start by asking you, where did the germ of this book begin for you? And maybe when did you start working on it?
I started in 2015, so that workshop that you mentioned, Amy's fiction workshop.
Amy Linder, who teaches at USC.
Who teaches at USC. That was when I started. So here we are in 2024. That's almost 9 years later, or it is 9 years later. But the germ of the story came because I was living in New Orleans at the time of the spill, and I read an interview with an oyster farmer as his oyster farm was closing down. And I knew nothing then about the oyster industry, that these farmers were in businesses for generations. And I knew nothing about oyster farming in that oysters take several years to reach market size, and an oyster farmer cultivates his reefs in years of production that he plans to harvest from. So the threat of an oyster spill was the threat of losing not just 1 year's livelihood, but many years. And it turned out, as we understand environmental spill, the environmental disaster, that would be more than a few years worth of damage. But we didn't know then how big the spill was going to be, or the extent of the disaster.
And that idea of these people in this area coming to terms with how terrible it's going to be, it's written so you're on the edge of your seat as a reader, because of course you know how it's going to go for them, but they don't yet know. And they're thrashing around against the information that's being presented to them. But so many characters in this book refuse to hear the information that's being presented, whether for political reasons, they don't believe the environmentalists, or because they can't begin to even absorb what's being told to them, that their livelihood is going to be taken from them. And I just found myself on the edge of my seat, for even though I knew how it was going to end, which was difficultly.
Right. Well, I mean, that was sort of feedback I had when I was revising the book, was that people couldn't understand that the oyster farmers didn't immediately think that this was going to be devastating, because oil spills happen every other year in the Gulf. They're very common. So they're no stranger to oyster spills or to oil spills, but this was unlike anything that they'd ever experienced before.
And so much of the economy is made up of people who work in oil. So there's that sort of push and pull of, if you're an oil guy, you're upset that they won't let you drill oil. But if you're an oyster man, then you want to not have the oil people. And there's this great moment. I don't know how many of you have already read the book, but where Jordan thinks to himself, if I was the son of an oil guy, I would be loyal to the oil people, but instead I'm a son of an oyster guy, so I'm loyal to the oyster people. And it just reminds you, however you grow up, that's where you are. It's in 3 points of view, distinct points of view from every member of the family, from the 2 brothers. We have Jordan, who's the oyster head. We have Benny, who's left the oyster business. He's a musician. And then we have the mother, May, who the oyster boat has been named after. How did you decide to write it in 3 distinct points of view, or how did that process come about?
I knew I wanted to tell as big of a story as I could, which was overly ambitious for my first novel, because it took me a long time to figure out how I could weave the point of views so that they were all building at the same pace, and so that they would climax at the same pace. But I wanted to sort of bring in even the community if I could, because this was a spill that affected more than a family. It affected people living all across the Gulf Coast. And I tried to bring in as many perspectives as I could, which was a big mess in the middle.
You did it, at least at the end. Was there one point of view that was trickier than the others, or one that was easier?
Yeah, May was the easiest perspective to write. We're both women, so there's that, but also we share sort of a similar personality. And then Benny is a musician and kind of a bohemian and a ne'er-do-well, and he was also easy to write. Jordan, the oyster farmer, was the hardest perspective to feel like I had captured authentically.
And yeah, I mean, Jordan, for those of you who haven't read, he's like your typical masculine, has trouble expressing himself. So being in his head and to hear what he's having so much trouble expressing to those around him, I think is so moving.
Mhm.
From the reader's point of view, you want to shake him and be like, just tell someone, but you are sad and worried. But of course, you won't. At one point, okay, there's a line. Driving a heavy-bottomed oyster boat in wide arcs in the bay was like driving a mower over a lawn. It was good work if you like to live in your mind. And when I read that, I thought that sounds like describing writing. That it's good work if you like to live in your mind. And it also just made me think the moments on the oyster boat are so, they have the texture of real life. You know, they feel like lived in moments. And I wondered how much research you did on oyster boats or just the idea of fishing for oysters.
Yeah, I went on a few oyster boats when I was doing research. People were very skeptical about allowing me to come with them.
Yeah, how did you convince them?
Well, I'd asked them to go out on the boat after we had done our interview, after we spent like hours together. And we talked about their childhood, and we talked about, you know, what I love about oil histories is that you walk into the interview and it begins with like, what year were you born, and where did you grow up, and what was it like growing up there? Which was important to me to capture because the oral history project was about the oil spill, but it's also a way of life in Louisiana that's threatened right now because of the numerous environmental challenges they're facing.
Right, because it's not just the oil spill. It's like
not
even before the oil, they had fresh water was being let in that ruined the oysters and all this other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm saying that I learned that from her book.
yeah. Coastline at a really rapid rate. It's like it's such a staggering rate that it's hard to conceptualize it even. They say a football field worth of land is lost every 100 minutes, which is staggering, you know.
Yeah.
Which, if you're an oyster farmer, hugely affects what you do because you can only grow oysters in a really specific salinity range, and the salinity of the bays is changing because of how the water is changing.
And I don't think I realized the taste and the texture and the size of the oyster depends on where it's grown. So that these particular oysters, there's a scene where Jordan, the brother who's been the oyster farmer all this time, and his ne'er-do-well brother comes and he has him taste all the oysters to see if he can taste which oyster they have produced. And he tastes one and he says it tastes like summer. And Jordan's so happy. He says, "That's our oyster. That's our bay's oyster." And I had no idea that what makes an oyster taste good is the water around it. So of course, when oil's spilling in, it tastes not good. What was one of the most surprising things you learned writing it and researching?
Oh my gosh, so many things. Because I spent hours and hours with people, and I think you could have written many novels from all of those hours of recording. One afternoon, I was talking, you mentioned earlier, sort of this fraught tension between oyster farmers and folks in the oil industry. And that's really fraught in a lot of Gulf Coast towns where people's families are usually divided between fishermen and oil industry. It's usually not just one or the other. Sometimes it is. And I had this really with a oyster oil industry, and he was talking about how horrific this bill was for his business. His brother was sitting at the table with him, and it was like so painful for him to like acknowledge his brother's reality that he was denying it, as if his brother, this oyster farmer, was being a crybaby. So that's not a fact, but it was.
And that's so reflected in the book. You see these people who live side by side, but they're having such different experiences of this oil spill. And some are just like, let us get back to oiling. I love May because at first she seems like a character who's not going to have a lot of agency. Maybe she's a wife, she's a mother, she wants her sons to get along. But then as the book moves forward and she starts to spiral, she's part of what brings the brothers together. There's this line I love. May read somewhere, and this was true of her and Al, this is her husband, that each couple was its own vaudeville act. And I wonder, did you have anyone in mind when you were thinking of May and of her and
Actually,
of her marriage to
that-
Al?
That line is from Zadie Smith. Each
yeah.
couple has its own vaudeville act.
You gotta steal a line from Zadie Smith. I have stolen.
I think it's just drawn from my own experience. You know, when you go to a party and you're with different roles that people expect you to play in conversation. That's how I understood that line.
Yeah, or you realize you're playing a role and you've played a role for so long, but you didn't know it until suddenly, like lightning, you realize, oh, we're playing our usual roles. Yeah, and I don't want to give away too many spoilers about the book because I don't know what you guys have read. Towards the end, Jordan thinks to himself, if you took him out of the water, he'd die. Cajuns have webbed feet.
A lot of sort of the emotional heft of the novel came from those interviews I did, and so it was really, I really wanted to try and create someone who was as compelling as the men that I met who went through what I described.
Was it difficult getting those men to speak to you and to open up to you, or it would start out difficult and then they would kind of let it all out?
I think because you start at the beginning, it's not just, it doesn't feel like a journalist interviewing you.
It
who
feels
just
like a history that
they told me the story of their life.
There's a moment when an interview is kind of taking place and Jordan thinks to himself, he's never been made to feel this interesting. No one's ever listened to him in this way. And I think that's true if someone's not used to being asked questions. It can be really, moving to be even asked a question and be listened to deeply. What's your writing process? I might end with that.
Sure. This novel in particular, because it was so researched, I found that I was often getting hamstrung trying to balance out the research that I had done versus making interesting things happen on the page. It
doesn't read like that. It reads like a page turner.
So free writes. I do a lot of free writes.
Do you have a certain amount of hours you write or a certain page number you get to?
2,000 or 1,002 hours.
You do 1,000 words a day.
Yeah.
We try to. That's a lot of words.
Or 2 hours.
What did you say? Or 2 hours? Yeah,
hours.
I'm staring out into space. Shall we open it to the audience and see if anybody else
I
has?
just have to say, your writing style reminds me of Station 11 or Station 9. Station 11 meets a new age wave of. I'll get back to you later. I'll just say, okay.
Emily St. John Mandel. She's great.
She's great. It's on my bookshelf and I haven't read it yet. So
I read half of it, and I say that in a nice way.
Best way possible, you know.
All right. Any other questions?
Any other questions? Where we devour the oysters?
Yeah.
Is it okay to devour oysters? Like, are the oyster farmers, they're excited for that? Are they worried they're gonna run out?
no, oyster farmers are delighted for folks to buy their product. Hey, Kyle.
What's been the most surprising thing to you having your first book out? You didn't expect?
I didn't expect so many people to ask such good questions along the way. I have done a few podcast interviews, one podcast with Zippy, which was wonderful. And in the interviews, you see how much people engage with the book. And that's really moving because it sort of feels like this was my dream. And I've been living in it alone for a long time, except for Jordan Blumetti's company, who's my editor at Zippy Books. So it's cool to be at this stage and to sort of share that dream.
I found it interesting that you said you've been working on this since 2015.
Mm-hmm.
So it must be an interesting experience to have all these people, around the world now knowing about this book, since you've been knowing about it for so long,
Yeah,
living with it for so long.
yeah, absolutely. And I'm really excited to send this to the oyster farmers I interviewed, because I'm going to New Orleans in a few weeks, and I'm sending them copies of the book now. So
I found it so, I hate to use the word convincing. This is when I'm teaching creative writing. I hate when my students talk about a story being realistic or not. I'm like, that's not the way we talk about short stories. But when I was reading this, I was like, so Joselyn grew up with oyster farmers. She grew up in an oyster farmer family. I was like, she must have, because that's the only way she would be this privy to this particular kind of information and to this specificity. So, yeah.
Are you working on another major project right now, or are you taking some time to enjoy your personal?
I'm actually working on a screenplay right now.
Welcome to LA.
Which just feels like a palate cleanser after having worked for so long on a novel.
What was the hardest thing about revising it?
I think it was because I worked on it so long. It was hard for me to reimagine parts of the book that needed to be reimagined. It sort of felt like it had been cemented, So that was hard.
Yeah, makes sense. Then you got to go back in, and the characters are like people that that you've given birth to. Any other questions?
Fun fact, on the cover, there were a bunch of different scenes that the illustrator had first put in the oyster, FYI. And we couldn't just arrive on the perfect scene. We have one more fun surprise with Viva, who makes these fabulous tote bags. You can see one hanging up there on the table on display, like a big, little pocket that you can use when you're on oyster farming or reading or whatever. They have given us 2 bags to give out tonight. So hopefully, if you get the bag, you're gonna buy the book, right? You're all gonna buy the book? Yeah. Okay. Great. So, were we gonna pick from the list? Where did the list go? Oh yeah.
A lottery.
A lottery. We were gonna. Where did the list? Here. I'll take the list. I was just gonna randomly pick. Oh yeah. Did all of you register? Okay. This is only open if you register. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. Here, actually, Joselyn, why don't you? All right. Close your eyes. And just put your finger down somewhere. And I'll pick the closest person who actually checked in, which is Tracy Muldar.
Oh!
Yay! Amazing, congratulations. And then, let's see, on the first page, let's do one more. Okay, close your eyes and pick. Closest to Krista Everage. All right, great, congratulations. Thank you so much to Joselyn. Please buy all of our books. It will mean so much.
And you'll sign them.
Joselyn will sign. Enjoy the oysters and the Prosecco. And please come back. We have events all the time. If you're not on our mailing list, please sign up. And thank you so much for coming all this way.